So, welcome to my makeshift audio training workshop. We're going to cover a few sessions this morning. First one's going to be mostly discussion based around theory. Going to talk a little bit about differences in consoles, signal flow, some equipment basics, and then hopefully get down to actually doing some practice mixing and showing you some tricks and how to use the various tools to get desired sound that you want to get. So we have some water and snacks over here if you guys want some, or there's some coffee brewing out front. Feel free to grab some anytime you need. So the first thing we're going to talk about is theory. Is there any questions before we get started? Great. So the thing about theory, and the reason why I want to talk about it is because I could tell you about EQ all day long. I could tell you about compressors and how to use faders all day long. But if you understand the theory behind why it works the way it works, it'll come that much quicker to you. You'll understand things a lot easier. And when you get into a situation where you have to make a decision based on what you hear, it'll all make sense to you. So we're going to kind of cover that, not in a whole lot of detail because they have 4-year degrees for this stuff. We're going to take maybe 30 to 45 minutes to cover it. Hopefully, it's going to be pretty quick. So the first thing we need to have is a working definition of what sound is. This is more of a technical definition. There's a physics definition, which is basically the vibration of pressure. So this room has an air pressure in it. So my voice is creating pressure that is traveling through the air molecules to get to your eardrum, and then your eardrum is taking that pressure, which is physiological, and interpreting it for your brain so you understand what I'm saying, the pitch I'm saying it at, constants and everything else. So basically, my simplified definition is just the change in air pressure that your brain can understand. That's basically what sound is. It is not moving air, it is displacing pressure through air. If you're in an area where you have no pressure, such as space, that's why you don't hear anything, because there's no air pressure to transfer through the air. So there's no air you get what I mean. So this is a really cool little picture that I saw someone else use, and I've kind of found my own version of it. But this is basically the same idea. You drop a rock in a body of water that's completely still, you're going to have a big, huge splash, which is where your sound originates from, and then it ripples out. So as the water ripples away, that is your wave of sound. That's your pressure going through the water. It's actually displacing the pressure of the water, and it's trying to get back to zero, which is why if you're 100 yards away from a sound source, it's quieter because the amplitude of that pressure has shrunk over that distance. Make sense? So we can use that to basically come up with a basic idea of what a sound wave looks like. This is not an actual sound wave. Complex sound waves look very much different, but this is how we study them. So there's 3 things you need to know about a sound wave. The first is the amplitude is just how high the wave is. That is your volume. So the taller the wave, the louder it is. That's also where we get to gain on soundboards. So when you're adjusting the gain knob on a soundboard, you're actually adjusting the amplitude of the sound wave. Frequency and cycles. So one frequency or one cycle, if you have a sound wave like this, start here at 0, up, negative, back to 0. That is one cycle of a sound wave. So how many of these happen in 1 second is your frequency, and that's also known as hertz. So the human range of hearing is 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. The lower the number, the lower the pitch. So 20 hertz is your sub lows. Then you get, as you get up higher, you get into your low range, then your mid range, and then your upper range as well. The last thing I need to talk about is phasing, because this happens quite a bit. This is probably the number one thing that people don't understand about sound, is that When you have multiple sources of sound that are the same thing, so you have one mic on a snare drum, but you have 10 speakers across the room. If you have 10 speakers across the room, they're all projecting that sound, that same pitch, and depending on where it hits you in the room will determine what time that this zero starts. So if you have something that starts here, and this is all happening, like I said, one cycle, so presume this is just 1 second for now. If you have it start here instead of at 0, and you have the sound wave that starts like this, and so this one carries on like this, like that. So what this is doing is, since this is starting here, this is what's called 180 degrees out of phase. So one cycle is 360 degrees. So from start to finish is 360. So if you start here, that's 180. Now, keep in mind that this can happen anywhere on this line. It doesn't have to be 180 or even here at 90 or 45 or wherever. This is just an idea. But if you have this at 180 degrees, this net result is as if that's going on. Nothing. So whenever you have two microphones on a snare drum, for example, you'll notice it might sound a little thin for those of you drummers that have done this before. That's the reason why, because you have two microphones pointing in opposite directions capturing the same sound. So as you walk through this room on a Sunday morning, you'll notice that the sound changes as you walk through the room, because where the speakers are setting, and they have such a wide throw angle, you're getting crossover as you walk through the room. And as you get through the room, you'll have spots where you actually have doubling going on, where you actually have the same signal happening. So when that happens, instead of it being something like that, the net effect is actually this. So does that make phasing a little easier to understand? The only time you have to worry about this is when you have two microphones on something, or if you have multiple speakers hitting the same coverage area. So right now these speakers are really close together. If you're to move from seat to seat, you're going to have some phasing issues today. Make sense?
Is that similar to acoustic? When you say the acoustics of this room is good, is that kind of the...
Sort of. Acoustics in a room basically means that there's very little like slapback effect, but you can also talk and be heard fairly well no matter where you're sitting in the room. This room, as long as you're not playing any like big huge band through it, it's actually an okay room because the walls are bare, so I can sit here and talk and you can be back in the corner and you can probably still hear me. But where you have a big huge PA and you have a snare drum that hits and you don't have any acoustic treatment on the walls, it's just going to echo across the room the entire time. And that's not good. So it depends on your application.
So if you have a room full of people, you set your audio up without that. You have to definitely adjust it.
You have to kind of adjust it, yeah. Rule of thumb for most church world is that you have to assume that your room is going to be mostly full. So you want to make your room as dead as possible. So if you listen, hear it bouncing back and forth, you want to make your room dead so when you clap like that, it's dead silent afterwards. That way, whenever you crank up your PA, you don't have those bouncing effects. Yeah, and we're actually going to talk about that in just a second too. Anything else? No? Okay. So like I said, this is a simple sound wave. This is what a sound wave actually looks like. And this is the reason why we use a simple sound wave to talk about sound and not a complex sound wave. That is basically, the same thing as this, but this is just what actually happens when you actually graph it out using some sort of a tool. This is also another picture of a sound wave, but this is taken over a much longer period. This is what it looks like when you look at it on a computer. If you space it out and you just take chunks of it, it's going to look more like the complex sound wave we just looked at. And if you look closely enough, you can see where there's this big, huge spike towards where the S is on sound wave. If you see the big, huge spike up, it doesn't look the same on the bottom of that same wave. So, so that's basically the way sound waves look. So we have to find some way of measuring it. This is what we call an SPL meter, sound pressure level. Basically, that is the amount of pressure that your speaker or your sound source is generating. It's how much you are displacing the air pressure around it. This is how, if you ever buy a speaker or an amp or anything from a manufacturer, they're always rated at SPL. That's how much volume they can generate. Decibels is what most people use, and it's an okay term to use, but it's somewhat incorrect. So if I was to say that this room is 80 decibels loud, that's not saying that the speakers are 80 decibels. That's just what it sounds like when it gets to you. So it's a reference point. So the decibel meter that people talk about is really an SPL meter, but it's sitting with you, not at the speaker, and it's measuring what that volume change is at that point, and it's giving you a decibel count. Usually it's how far off is it from 0. That's typically when people talk about decibel meter, it's how much difference is it from 0. When we start talking about EQ and compressors and everything else and talking about thresholds, decibel is actually how much you're changing from the source sound. So the volume coming into the system could be already at 80 decibels. That's not the way it actually works, but when you get into things such as EQ, you're going to boost the low end by 5 decibels. Well, you're actually just changing that source 5 decibels. So we're not talking about pressure level there. Sorry?
You're not saying you're making it 5 decibels, you're just changing it by 5.
Yeah, we're changing the source by 5. That's basically what that decibel means. So depending on what you're looking at and depending on what you're using, if you're using a decibel meter, that's how loud it is in the room compared to 0. But when you're looking at it from a soundboard perspective, it's how much are you changing the original sound. Okay? So there are some other things we can do called attenuation, and that's just basically the process of taking a sound and reducing it by a set amount. It's basically just used to take a really loud input volume and drop the signal out a little bit so it's a little bit easier to use when you get into the actual soundboard. Most of the time you'll find these on direct boxes. All of our direct boxes here, and I think all of them at Mount Carmel also have attenuation pads on them. It's usually like a -10 or a -20. That's just basically all they say on there. And basically you're just dropping the input volume by 20 decibels of volume or 10 decibels of volume.
Kind of like limiter, right? Limits.
Not really. It's taking this amplitude and dropping the amplitude down.
Okay.
A limiter does something a little differently. Whereas, so if this is your original volume and you say you put a 20 decibel attenuation on it, it's going to look like this. It's actually going to follow the same ratio of curve. It's just not going to be as high.
Why would you want to do that at the source?
Most of the time your board will have maybe like a single pad on it. This board actually does not have one, believe it or not. The X32 does not have an attenuation pad on it. Some of these older boards here will have like a little button you can push.
But wouldn't that control that still with your gain?
You can. I'm going to argue that you want to also think about having enough gain on your board. So if you have too little gain on your board, it's going to affect the signal flow throughout the rest of the board differently. If you can get a reasonable amount of gain, it's going to sound more uniform across all of your various signal flow processes. Okay? So that's all we need to really talk about with that. Back to what you're talking about in this room with reflections. Basically, anything that's solid that can reflect pressure well. So like a drywall, glass, Anything that's wood. Wood is also a good one. So basically, anything that you can normally reflect even light off of will just reflect sound back into your room. Absorption, on the other hand, is anything that's very porous, such as the cloth on the pews. There's also baffling gear that can diffuse sound and split it so it's not reflecting straight. It actually takes the sound and reflects in multiple ways, so it loses a lot of the pressure behind it. Curtains are good, especially theatrical curtains, because they're really thick and really heavy, but they're also very porous, so they can actually absorb a lot more of that pressure without reflecting it back into the room. So that is that. The next thing we need to talk about is feedback. Who here knows what feedback is? That never happens, right? Never happens. Sometimes feedback is actually a good thing if you're using electric guitar and you're actually going for that kind of effect, just as an example. But most of the time, it's usually pretty bad. If I was to turn this microphone on and turn on this PA, you'll start to hear a really loud hum, and it'll get louder as it goes. Basically what it's doing is you're taking a sound that's being amplified, projecting it through a speaker system, and then whatever it is you're capturing the sound with is capturing the same frequency, re-amplifying it again, going back through the system, and it's just basically creating this loop, and it's just getting louder and louder and louder. So that's what feedback is. If you walk in front of a speaker with a microphone, it's going to feedback. If you have your gain set too high on a microphone, it's going to feed back because it's going to pick up the reflections in the room. It's going to come back into the microphone. Microphone's picking up the sound again. It's going to feed back. No feedback ever happens in here. Ever. We always have feedback in here. So ideally, you want no feedback, or at least limit it as much as you can. There are some tricks you can do to crank up the gain on something and reduce feedback. But it's one of those things you have to kind of play with and know what you're looking for. There's not an easy way for me to show it to you, but basically if you have once we actually start looking at this, we have what's called a real-time analyzer. When you're looking at the EQ on a channel, it'll actually show you this big, huge peak. And then you can take your EQ and find it and drop the EQ there. But we'll talk about some of those tricks a little bit later as well.
What about phasing? Can you use phasing to eliminate feedback?
You can, but phasing is not a. You're basically just taking you're basically taking that. When you're talking about phasing on a board, the only phase switch you have is to flip it 180 degrees, which basically means you're just taking all the positives and making them negative, and all the negatives and making them positive. So it's not going to necessarily eliminate it. It'll probably drop the signal strength enough in various spots, but it's also going to make your signal sound very thin. So it's not going to sound very full anymore.
So what I'm finding is, when I was watching last week, a lot of the feedback is actually coming from the keyboards through the vocal mics.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't sure if there was, just when you talk about phasing, if there's a way to phase those separately, 180 degrees.
Not really. What you can do is you can alter what the keyboard's giving you, and hopefully the microphone will pick up less of it. But often it's your microphone is going to be your source of feedback, because the keyboard itself is not generating it.
Right,
It's
right.
just what the microphone's picking up.
But yeah, I'm just picking up what I was listening to was I'm picking up more of the keyboard rather than the vocal.
Right.
The vocal wasn't giving me the feedback. The keyboard music was giving me feedback.
Right, but the keyboard itself wasn't. It was just
Right.
coming through the vocal mic. Yeah. Yeah. No, we're actually talking about somebody else.
No, it was actually Chris last week. So
Okay.
Yeah, Chris was playing last week, but he wasn't actually singing. So,
he wasn't.
So any questions on feedback?
Well, okay,
Yeah.
so I notice when I'm singing that if it starts to feedback, I can get closer to the microphone and kind of defeat it.
Yes.
And that's something that I wish that we could tell everybody.
Yes. This is going to be, as hopefully most people here are going to be more interested in sound. There are a few people who are musicians here, obviously. But the number one thing that kills me is that whenever somebody has a microphone and starts feedback, they just point it straight down at the floor, or straight out, which makes it even worse. Ultimately, feedback is caused by the fact that we have to crank gain on microphones as high as we do.
Because it's too far away.
Because it's too far away from somebody's face. And I'm going to talk a little bit later on for the people who work with vocalists. Depending on how you hold the microphone, drastically changes how much gain we have to give it. You can keep it in the same spot, but just changing the direction that you hold the microphone significantly alters how much gain we give it. But that's a little later on today.
Okay.
This is mostly just like a.
Well, the microphones to stand.
Exactly. We used to have everything on stands here. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, so we'll get into more examples and how to fix some things a little bit later. This is mostly just like, here's what feedback is.
Okay.
So distortion is another thing that's fairly common, especially with guitars, but that's intentional. But if you start getting distortion on a microphone or anything that's not designed to have distortion in it, that's usually because you're putting too much gain on a signal. You're overloading it. So anytime you have a soundboard and you see a little red light that says clip, yeah, that's bad. That's where you get distortion. So depending on how much you compress something too, you can also distort it too. So. All right, so here's some terminology in terms of things we see on typical soundboards. First one is your gain, which I already explained. It's just basically adjusting the volume, adjusting the amplitude of your sound source. So turn your gain up, more amplitude, more volume. Turn your gain down, less amplitude, less volume. EQ, equalization. This is the process of modifying various frequencies of an input source. Obviously, this is one frequency, and every instrument has multiple frequencies that it's generating. Even if you're playing one note, you have harmonic values and everything else that instrument is generating. So we can modify this using equalization. We'll get into some specifics later, but this is what's called a parametric EQ. Basically, this is your most common EQ that you'll find on a soundboard. It's using what's called filters, which is your low, your mid, your high. And you can use those to modify various frequencies of that instrument. So some common things you'll see for every parametric EQ is every knob will have a gain. You'll always have a gain knob with an EQ knob. But sometimes you'll see a frequency knob where you can adjust which frequency you are modifying. So if you have a frequency knob, you can turn up your gain, and then you could sweep it left to right to adjust what you're listening to. You also have something that's called a Q knob. This is not very common on traditional soundboards. In fact, you very rarely ever see this. But on digital consoles, you'll see them all the time. But basically adjusts how many frequencies around your target frequency you are changing. So the higher the number, yeah, that's how wide it is. The higher the number is the steeper the ratio, which means the less frequencies you're modifying. So the lower the number means you have more of a rounded curve. So if you look at this picture, you'll have, it comes up to the line, and then you'll see a little dip. That's kind of like an average Q. But then over here, you'll see like a little sharp drop. That is a very high Q value. You're seeking for one specific frequency there, instead of modifying a range of frequencies. So, yeah. So with parametric EQs, you have 3 different types of filters that they call them. First is the parametric or the notch, which is the one that most people are common with. You turn the gain knob up, and it modifies that particular frequency or the frequencies around it. A shelf, which is typically your high or your low, but usually your mids are always parametric. A shelf basically says, okay, every frequency above, if it's a high one, or if it's a low, it's everything below. We're going to modify everything by that amount. So at the very end, that one on the right is a shelf. So you're basically taking, okay, at this point, I want to modify everything above this frequency and boost it. That's what that last one looks like. And a cut, which is also called a pass, depending on who you're talking to, they might call it a cut filter or a pass filter. Basically, a cut, anything below or above that frequency is cut. Or the alternative is everything above that frequency is passed. What that means is once you get to the EQ, if you're passing it, that means you're going to just listen to everything that's in that pass zone. Or you can cut everything below it. Same concept, it's just two different ways of talking about it. And the last thing that we need to look at is called a 31 band EQ. This is basically 31 parametric filters that you cannot modify the Q value or the frequency. However, this covers basically the entire spectrum. If you need more than 31 bands of EQ on something, you need to change the microphone or however it is you're using to capture it. Typically, these are only used for main PA systems. You usually never use these on an actual channel or an instrument. So that's EQ. Next thing we need to talk about is a gate. The best way I can describe this is if you have a pipe and you have a cover on that pipe. Well, you have a spring on that cover that basically says once the water reaches a certain pressure, that cover is going to open and let the water through. Same concept with audio. You're going to have a threshold that says, okay, unless your volume reaches here, I'm not going to let this signal pass through the rest of the soundboard. So once your volume gets to here, once it goes past here, all of a sudden it's going to start processing that signal and you have volume. That's what a gate does. A compressor is basically the opposite of that. It's going to let everything through, but once you get to this part here, it's going to start reducing the volume by a predetermined ratio. We're going to talk about ratios and stuff later, but that's basically what a compressor does. It basically limits how much volume you get past a certain point. Kind of like a bottleneck. So once you get to the full capacity of the pipe, it starts bottlenecking down so you can't push that much more water through it. A limiter is a compressor, but it lets nothing extra through. So once you get to the capacity of that pipe, no more water can get through. That's what a limiter does. We just did that. A fader, which is these right here, these little knobs here that slide up and down, it's basically like your final volume check. So you're going to have your gain that changes all this, you have your EQ, you have your compressors, your gates, and everything that you use to modify a signal. And this is your final volume before it goes out to your main PA system or wherever it is you're sending that channel to. So those are basically your common elements that you'll need to worry about with a soundboard. The next thing that we're going to talk about is something called effects. It's basically modifying a channel or a signal to accomplish a certain sound, such as a delay. You want to put a delay on something, that is an effect. It basically creates like an echo. Reverb is basically a delay with an incredibly short repeat timer. So anything that's less than about half a second is considered a reverb. Anything over half a second is usually considered a delay, depending on what you're using. So there are some other examples up there that you might hear about, such as exciters or maximizers. Those are other types of effects. We don't normally use those, but if you hear somebody talking about that, they're talking about an effect. So also compressors, gates, and limiters are all considered effects, even though they're tools that we use quite a bit, but they're still considered an effect. The next thing is called grouping. This is where you take multiple channels and you assign them to a single control or another channel that operates completely independently. There's a DCA and there's a subgroup. A DCA is basically just a way to control the fader volume uniformly across multiple channels. So if you have different fader volumes at different points and you want to raise them all by the same amount, which you'll see later on when I show you a good picture of a fader and we talk about more, the scale from bottom to top is not the same. So you have a 0, and the further you get away from 0, the more that scale changes. So if you have things that are separated a lot, a DCA will allow you to move all of those volumes at a uniform amount. That's what DCA is used for. A subgroup basically takes all the channels and groups them into a separate single channel that you can then use for anything else. You can apply effects to those. You cannot apply an effect to a DCA. You cannot EQ a DCA. It is basically, the DCA is only controlling the amount of volume these faders are giving you. But the channels themselves are still independent. Okay? So I'm not going to go through all these, but these are some common acronyms or some terms you might see when dealing with a sound system of some sort. You have FOH, which is front of house, which is where your soundboard is, where your audio people is. Back there is our front of house. At Mount Carmel, where you sit with the computer, that's front of house. That's just what they call it. You have PFL, which is pre-fader level, which is the same thing as like a solo switch. When you look at a soundboard, you'll see a PFL sometimes on there. That's basically your solo switch. And some other things here. You have sends and returns and inserts and various things like that. So some common things you might see when dealing with sound systems. Stereo versus mono. This has come up to me a couple times, like, why don't we mix in stereo here? There's a couple reasons why we don't mix in stereo here. One, it's actually really complicated. It's a lot easier to mix in stereo as long as you're not worried about a uniform experience in your room. So if you want to mix in stereo and you want to have your right PA over here, that's fine. But if you put something in your right PA, whoever's sitting over here will not hear it because it's only being projected over here. So we always mix in mono, typically. If you listen to a CD, it's always mixed in stereo because they're assuming that you're listening in an enclosed space where you have a left and a right, that you can actually hear things coming out to the left and the right. But mono is basically you're taking all your channels and sending them out one output source to one set of speakers, and each speaker's projecting the same thing. That is mono. So with stereo, you can pan things to the left and the right. The main problem that is you just don't hear things in stereo anymore. If you're sitting in a room and the PA system is way in front of you, even if it's in stereo, by the time it gets to you, it's in mono again because the signals have converged on each other. So that is the main reason why it's more difficult to mix in stereo. It's hard to get a good stereo mix unless you have hundreds upon thousands of dollars worth of gear that you can use for it. In a room like this with a distributed sound system where you have an arc, it's almost impossible. We'd have to have probably close to a $750,000 sound system in this room, which only seats about 600 people, just to get a stereo mix in here well. So while we're talking about sound, we're going to talk about how loud sound can get. So what is too loud? Depending on what you're playing and who you're playing for, that will change. In this room on a Sunday morning, 85 to 90 decibels is as loud as we're going to get. Anything over that is considered too loud. However,
By the people sitting out here.
by your audience.
I hear people say, why does it have to be so loud? And I'm like,
Why does it have to be so quiet? So most of the time, loudness is determined by your culture. Whoever you're playing for, that is your culture, which is why you can be a traveling musician and everywhere you go, you have a different volume every night because everywhere you go, you have a different culture. So the best way to do this, if you have no idea, if you walk in somewhere and you're running sound for somebody and you want to know how loud it is supposed to be, always ask somebody who's in charge, someone who's there every week. I call it a stakeholder. So a pastor, an elder, a deacon, somebody who's there who can tell you, hey, this is a little too loud, or hey, you can crank it up a little bit. And if there's no one there that you can ask, always ask whoever's leading worship, how loud do you want it? That way if someone comes up to you later and says, hey, it's too loud, it's a bit, hey, I'm just following this guy's direction. And if someone still comes up to you and says it's too loud, you send them to me. There are some OSHA safety requirements that we have to mention. They're up there on the screen. Most people say anything over 90 decibels is violating OSHA regulations. Well, as you can see, it is not. OSHA says once you get past a certain volume of threshold, you have a time limit. Once you get past 90 decibels, anything over 8 hours is considered dangerous for your hearing. Anything over 95 decibels, if you have 4 hours of prolonged listening experience, it is damaging to your hearing. As I said earlier, we never get above 90 in this room. So anyone who comes in and says we're violating OSHA regulations, right here it is. We are not.
Unless we have an 8-hour service.
Unless you have an 8-hour service. And even then, most people won't be in this room for 8 hours. So that is where OSHA comes into play. Usually when you're in a factory, you have a lot of loud noises, but when you're in a concert venue, the same rules apply. And I put it up there for reference, but for most people, most rock bands are 110 to 120 decibels, typically. So if you look at the chart, after 30 minutes of listening to a rock band, you need to be wearing hearing protection. Most people don't, but that's why most people can't hear anymore. So that's why your ears bleed when you leave a rock concert. So again, if you ever have any questions about how loud it should be in your room, always ask somebody who is higher up the food chain. Okay? The last thing we need to talk about as far as theory goes, that it's mostly here just for a reference. You don't really need to know about this, but something called the Fletcher-Munson curve. Now, this is actually really important. Assuming that all sound is the same volume across the entire spectrum, from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. The Fletcher-Munson curve is basically what frequencies are you more susceptible to hearing? Which is why whenever you say someone says it's really harsh, it's really loud in here, it's usually because right at that 2,000 to 5,000 range, that's where your ear hears the most volume. It's just perceived volume. So when you have your subs kicking in at 90 decibels, the volume of your subwoofer compared to the volume of your vocal at 90 decibels, the vocal still stands out a whole lot more because it's just natural for your ear to hear that frequency range. So whenever you're walking through a room and it sounds really harsh, but the rest of it sounds okay, it's usually because they don't have their EQ on their system tuned properly and they haven't cut out enough of that range to kind of make it a little more uniform across the board. So that's basically what the Fletcher-Munson curve is really all about. And that's going to do it for your basic overview of theory. Any questions so far about anything?